There has to be information to stakeholders prior to consultation events. It is not reasonable to just invite people to a public meeting, tell them about a project, and expect them to have an opinion about it in a short time. This information needs to be provided early on in a way that is meaningful locally.
When we go to administrative hearings, we will see the date the meeting took place, the agenda, and all of the pertinent documents. If there was an upcoming meeting, you could find all this information at least a few weeks in advance, so you can read these documents and then come prepared for that meeting. If, however, a member of the public missed the meeting, you will actually find the meeting minutes later, which summarizes the comments that were made by the decision makers and the public, as well as the final decision being taken. And many of these are also recorded. Members of the public can also access any historical records for at least some years back, as long as they have been putting them on this site website, and when everything actually started to be digitalized. The public hearing and the repositories served as an important function because they force a certain degree of openness and create a legal record for which decisions have been made and which decisions have also been challenged maybe in court. So the decisions made from the Planning Commission and the Historic Commission and the division and the commission as well, and they could be appealed, although most of the processes are actually not public hearings, as you can see. The author argues that because public hearings are required by law, they can become simply a procedural hoop to which the agency must jump, not allowing the public to have much impact on the decision and no chance for collaborative planning solving. So the author reminds us that consultation doesn't always result in agreements. Sometimes all that occurs is that positions are clarified through an interaction, and at least ideally everybody will understand the reasoning behind the decision that was made, although oftentimes this is actually not the case. If there is at least an agreement, for the most part, even if consensus is not achieved, the agency is able to proceed with sufficient legitimacy, and those who do not support the decision just accept the decision. Hans and Anne-Marie Blaker, 1994, in this writing, have used the term informed consent to describe this level of participation. They write, "We define informed consent as the grudging willingness of opponents to grudgingly go along with a course of action that they actually are opposed to." The author of the book describes this collaborative approach as consensus seeking, as opposed to consensus building. In this approach, the agency seeks consensus as much as possible, knowing that some people will be in disagreement. The goal is then to have people agreeing as much as possible. The agency reserves the right to make the final decision when consensus is not reached. Even if there's not consensus going through the process, it helps the public to influence the final decision. So the public might have a little bit of say inside of this consensus seeking. Consensus seeking is often confused with consensus building, which is a process that has the goal of reaching full agreement between all the parties. Lawrence Susskind, who is a lawyer at the Urban Planning Department at MIT, as a matter of fact, he was the advisor of one of the professors here, Dania Rumori, and I really recommend you to take her class because all of the class is about techniques for public facilitation and consensus building, which is such an important skill in planning. So he is one of the leading advocates of the consensus building approach, and he actually states consensus building is a process of seeking unanimous agreement. So this means like everyone. It involves a good faith effort to meet the interest of all the stakeholders. Consensus has been reached when everyone agrees they can live with whatever is proposed after every effort has been made to meet the interests of all stakeholder parties. So the question for the facilitator, like Dr. Rumor, is who is doing consensus building, or for someone who is doing consensus building, really is like, can I live with that? As long as everyone who is part of the process says, I can live with that, then you are achieving an agreement. So if someone says, I cannot live with that, then the decision needs to be really tweaked until people agree and they can actually answer if they can live with the decision that was just made. And that's like what is like consensus agreement or consensus building. Well, is this true that you can go all day talking about an issue and not necessarily have anyone or have everyone achieve unanimity? The goal is to strive to seek unanimity, but settle for overwhelming agreement after every effort has been made by the group to respond to the concerns of those who said, I cannot live with this. Maybe you will not get an agreement that is overwhelmingly supported by the participants, but often if the group takes that as the goal, then they can build consensus. Lawrence Susskind says that most dispute resolution professionals believe that groups or assemblies should seek unanimity, but settle for whatever overwhelming agreement that goes as far as possible towards meeting the interests, again, of all the stakeholders. Susskind argues that the goal is to craft a solution to the problem and agree on that. In other words, a skilled and neutral facilitator. By neutral, I mean that the facilitator is not, it doesn't have an opinion, so it's not biased. It simply facilitates the discussion of the group and helps them to achieve an agreement or a consensus. So if they are very skilled at doing this, they will play this role and be very effective at the people achieving some agreement. Some criticism of this approach is that it assumes that 100% of the people will agree, when in fact some people feel coerced into the agreement. So we also assume that those who sign on the agreement represent the constituencies they claim to represent. So it requires that people are representative in that group to begin with. And many times the people that come to these meetings or that are part of these processes might not even represent that particular group. It also assumes that the agency itself not only agrees with the decision being made, but it also has the legal and budgetary authority to implement a consensus decision. So if we are like a group that it is trying to think about the use of like just a body of water, but if we don't have like power to actually like look over that body of water or what it will require to preserve it, or who are the uses and all that, then this is not really that meaningful. So it again, ideally the group that comes to a consensus is because, for example, if there's a lake that there's different stakeholders municipalities, counties, just different groups interested in these assets, that they will agree of what can be done, but they also that they have some power to make a plan or some decision about that body of water, for instance. So when the agency creates some expectations that are unfulfilled, then this will result in mistrust and people not wanting to be involved in other processes because again they didn't have any power at the end.